I would like to present to you, if you could put your hands together, Dr. Torres Souder.
Before I begin this little journey of CHamoru revisionism, redefining historical periods, I really want to thank you all for coming. I do see many, many friends. I see relatives. I see colleagues. I see teachers. I see sisters. The class of '68 is represented here, and that's a very near and dear classification to me. I see young children, my nephews, my niece, my nieces. I see people who care. I see my friends, and I know the sacrifice that some people make to come here. But I really do appreciate it. I really do appreciate it. You know, this is a lonely business, and when we don't get the kind of warmth and nurturance that we need, sometimes we feel that, you know, we challenge ourselves into thinking, well, why do it at all? But the reason why we do it is because we care about our history, we care about our people, we care about the continuity of our peoplehood. And that's what CHamoru revisionism is directed toward. It's about nation building. It's about discovering who we are from the perspective that has not been well established. It's about exploring things that we didn't feel we had the right to explore in the first place. So what gives us the right? I want to set the record straight. History is about storytelling, and every human being has a story to tell, and we all have the right to tell that story. And CHaMorus have the responsibility to tell the story of our ancestors in the way that we've not had an opportunity to do that before. And so that's part of what I'm going to be talking about. I have slides. I want you to read along with me or listen to me as I read some of these points because they're important. But more importantly, I want you to think about taking a journey with me through a different scenario about writing history, so that you understand where I'm coming from. Because if you know me, you know I advocate first and foremost for the CHamoru language. If we're, as Sammy said in his column on Sunday, speaking CHamoru is teaching CHamoru. And speaking CHamoru is also empowering ourselves to become revisionist historians, to discover what our ancestors are telling us through our language. So if you know anything about me, you know that I'm fanatic about that. I'm also a strong advocate for literacy of all in any language. And I think that all of this comes together in the way that I define CHamoru revisionism and the way that I hope we can begin to see how we need to redefine our historical periods from a revisionist perspective. I want you to get into the mood. So Leonard, I didn't ask for your permission because you gave it to me a long time ago, but Leonard wrote a chant and his group performed it, and I'd like you to share this calling to action with me.
Marianas. Guai fi kulo Marianas. Sa manananga itauta mahami. Itauta mahami. mahami. Go have fed goody talent mahami. Wahai pi kulo mahami. Wahai pi kulo mahami. Tihia mam gini hang hadun ni hijak. Jahan guai pi kulo mahami. Jahan guai pi kulo mahami.
Bonito, no? Have we heard the call? Have we heard our ancestors calling us to tell their story and ours? Because that's what this is all about. Ikulu, the trumpet shell. The trumpet shell, the voice of our ancestors. A call to action. Imata, matata, our insight, our indigenous wisdom that only we have. Are we aware of that? Because mata allows us to see what is not visible to the eye. We're not talking about vision. We're talking about insight. Manyayna, our ancestors. Do we hear them? Do we want to know what they have to teach us? And are we willing to be brave enough to withstand criticism, to revise and challenge conventional thought so that we can tell their story? They are the wise and ancient first people of our land, the Tautautano from whom we descend. Are you ready to become their voices? That's what revisionist historian or revisionist historiography is all about. And that's what we're called to do as historians. Italin Mami, you heard in the chant. The chanter saying, our rope is strong. Our connection is strong. Our roots are strong. Do we want to demonstrate that strength by showing our connection to our past? We must not be afraid to venture into the mata of our ancestors and be propelled by their wisdom to change our history, by changing the way we look at ourselves and our reality. This is the purpose and promise of Indigenous revisionism. What am I talking about? If we look at the way history is commonly written on Guam today, and we look at the way it's been written in the past, it's not amazing to come up with the question, well, where were the CHamoru's in all of this? What were they doing? What were they thinking? What were they feeling? How did they respond? That's what I'm talking about, the missing link. So when we think about historical revisionism, what does it mean? It is reinterpreting the historical record, offering a different perspective. It doesn't mean that perspectives that have been offered are wrong. It simply means that they're incomplete, and we have to complete the story. It is challenging conventional historiography, and we'll talk a little bit about what that means in the context of Guam history. Why challenge conventional historiography? Why don't we just leave it alone? Well, revisionists believe that conventional historiography is incomplete. It's an exclusive portrayal of history that leaves out the experiences of ordinary people. And this is not just applicable to Guam history, it's applicable to history the world over. So revisionists have been working hard since the turn of the 18th to the 19th century to fill in the blanks, so to speak, to reinterpret what was always considered to be the truth, right? Conventional historiography is often elitist and sexist. It leaves out women. It leaves out the experiences of ordinary people. It's commonly known as the great men, great deeds type of history. So every child on Guam learns about George Washington, right? About Abraham Lincoln, about the presidents. But do our children learn about our Magatlahi and our Magathaga? Do they learn about the wise people in their own families? No. They learn about the redwoods of California, but they don't learn about the ifit of Sinahanya. If there are ifit trees in Sinahanya, and I planted one. You know what I mean? It's not bad to learn about the redwoods. It's not bad to learn about the Algonquins, right? Because they teach that in 2nd grade. Liam shared his social studies book with me, and the Algonquins were in the 1st chapter. It's not bad. But is it good that they're not learning about the first peoples of our lands? That's the question. And conventional historiography assumes one interpretation of historical events is the most factual or authentic. So people like me and others who do history quibble about authenticity and validation. And how do you know that this is true? And my question is always, how do we know that it isn't? What if it is? I have a right to interpret, right? So historians interpret events and people that happen in time. That's what historians do. And who says we can't be historians of our own experience? That's the question. The goal then of Indigenous historiography, or CHamoru revisionism, is to redirect our historical narrative and place ourselves and our ancestors as the primary actors in our collective historical experience. So how do we do that? In other words, it is the telling of our story, our lived experience, and our ethos, our worldview, beliefs, myths, legends, and rituals by Indigenous storytellers using our cultural insights, our mata. Now, this doesn't mean, as I said before, that we throw out or discount written history from the conventional view. It doesn't mean that we create a bonfire at MARC, right? Because that's where many of the historical treasures are kept. The goal is to balance the historical account by offering culturally informed perspectives. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to balance historical interpretation, not do away with one at the, or create one at the expense of another. People have often asked me, well, are the accounts and the stories and the reports and the letters written by missionaries, explorers, colonial administrators, adventurers, anthropologists, archaeologists, and linguists, some of who are in this room, have provided valuable contributions for Indigenous revisionists to sharpen insightful interpretations. All of that is good. It's inherently sound. But if it's the only thing that drives our understanding of our historical experience, then it's incomplete. These historical records are invaluable to our reconstructing and reinterpreting cultural practice and events for which we have no living memory. Because we didn't live in the 1800s, right? And our ancestors didn't write us letters. They didn't jot down their historical observations. But we can still tell their story because they gave us something that is priceless. They gave us their language. And in our language are embedded secret codes of information about who they are, how they think, how they name, how they express. And it helps us in the interpretive process. Early in my journey as a student and teacher of Guam history, I was reminded that history will never give you an answer to a question that you have not asked. You know, when I was getting ready to do my dissertation in the early 80s, actually it was in 1976, I remember this clearly. I was asked to speak at a class at Voctec High School during CHamoru Week. In those days, it was CHamoru Week. So I went to the class, and it was a high school class. There were about 30 or 40 students in the room. And we were talking about, you know, great men, great deeds. We were talking about Kepuha and Matapang and Hurao and Gadao and all the Magatlahi that were known at the time. And this young girl kept looking at me. She was a 9th grader. She kept looking at me, and then I said, "Do you have any questions?" And she raised her hand and she said, "If only men lived during that time, who had the babies?" You know, everybody in the class laughed because they thought, "Ay, la pobre, she doesn't even know about the birds and the bees, no?" But she asked a very, very profound question, and it disturbed me. And I tried to answer her the best I could, and then I realized myself, for the first time, really, I fully confronted the reality that women had no voice in history on Guam at that moment. And that Magatlahi were named, chiefs were named, but Magahaga were not. And I thought, what the heck? Why? I knew that there were Magahaga. I knew that they were high-ranking women in the clan. I knew that women had greater power in our social structure than men did, because we come from a matrilineal society. Why then could I not name a single Magahaga? And it disturbed me greatly and changed the course of my dissertation inquiry from the political status debate to finding that female voice. And that all came from an innocent question that everybody chuckled at. If there were only men during that period, who had the babies? Isn't that an incredible question? So I believe from that day forward, no question is a stupid question, because even the most stupid sounding questions can lead you to discover a lot about what you weren't conscious of or aware of. Creating culturally informed interpretations builds on facts, not fiction. This is another bone of contention between conventional historiographers and revisionists. And on Guam, believe me, we have these kinds of discussions. Maybe not face to face, maybe behind the back, but we have these kinds of discussions. You know, how does she know that that's a fact, that that's true? How do we know that what Freycinet wrote is true? Right? There are many ways to validate observation. But just because we don't write it in books doesn't mean that it didn't exist or that you can't think it. And so that's part of the only book from my point of view that is unchallengeable is the Bible. Everything else can be challenged as far as I'm concerned. So, you know, we have to get used to this idea. We're not comfortable with the idea that we actually have the authority and the responsibility to offer interpretation. We're not comfortable with that, and that's why there are not very many Guam historians who are Chamorro, because of that reason. Our seat of wisdom, our nexus of knowledge, if you will, lies in Finot-Chamorro, or also known as Finohaza. That's where the wisdom comes from. That's what our ancestors gave us. And that's where we can discover so much about how our ancestors thought. How did our Mariana make sense of the world that they came to know and love as their homeland? What were the challenges that they experienced? Our spoken indigenous language is truly the umbilical cord of our mata. For the children in the room, it's critical. Seth and Liam, are you listening? I am so proud that you are on a journey of learning to speak Chamorro, because that will connect us more than anything else. You know, when the chanter called out and said, our rope or our umbilical cord or our roots are strong, they're only as strong as if they are connected to something stronger. Flying in the wind, they're worthless, right? It's only when we're connected with something stronger than ourselves that we become of great strength. And so that connection, that cord, the umbilical cord, italeta, that is our connection to our ancestors. And they made sure that we would understand their world by giving us our language. It's in our hands now to determine whether we want to give it up, disconnect, plug our ears and disconnect from our heritage, right? Or whether we want to make sure that we engage in the most purposeful act of continuity and nation building, which is learning our language. Our mata allows Chamorro revisionists to see things from the inside out. You know, we talk about halum tuzan. The child first becomes aware of the world from the womb. We even have puntantono, tuzantono. The duendes, they live in the inside of our land. All of those references show a great reverence to internal wisdom, to internal spaces, to sacred spaces from within. Our mata, which is our umbilical cord, which is our language, allows us to tap into that source. Now you might think, you know, Loling's gone crazy, okay? She's overboard. How can you actually tap in? Children have taught me that you can journey through portals. And, you know, Kiko, I know that you all know Kiko because we wrote the book Kiko, you know, Kiko's Adventure together. But Kiko said to me one day, he was 6 years old and wise, and he said, Auntie Lo, never be afraid of your imagination. Okay? And imagination is not necessarily fake. It's not necessarily imaginary as in not real. You can find lots of things in your imagination. That was a wise counsel from a little boy, because it taught me not to be afraid to think, you know, out of the box. So as compared to conventional historiography on Guam, which is written from the outside looking in, what Chamorro revisionism does is it allows us to look at history, at events, at big events, small events, time, from the inside out. okay? What do I mean? Okay, so let's look at the conventional way our story is laid out in historical accounts. Everybody who's had even a little bit of Guam history knows these periods. And for God's sake, let's get rid of this notion that Guam's history began in 1521. Okay, that was an event in Magellan's life. It did have an impact on the lives of our ancestors. But our ancestors, who were among the great navigators of the Pacific, first settled in our homeland around 3,500 to 4,000 years ago. So 1521 is just a drop in the bucket in that historical record, right? It isn't the beginning. It's not itutuhonta, as we would say. How do we know? Well, linguists, archaeology, forensic anthropology, our ancestors themselves, through their human remains, their artifacts, and enduring traditional practices which we still connect with today, tell us much about who they were and where they came from. We know that they were part of a seafaring community that began to populate the island Pacific about 5,000 years ago. They came to the Marianas about 4,000 years ago. And there are human remains and artifactual remains that document that. So we know how long ago they settled. We know what they found in terms of the land. They found a place that was not human, where there was no human habitation. So they decided to settle here, those first navigators. Their remains, like the latte structures and so on and so forth, give us an idea of how they lived and how they buried their dead. What kind of social structure they had. What kind of kinship arrangements they had. The traditions that we continue to practice today, the values and beliefs we hold dear, our perspective on the world, all of this has been passed down for centuries. We calculated this a while ago, for 150 generations. That's a lot of generations. Through the CHamoru language. Our language is the primary source or wellspring of our mata. You know, a wellspring is like an abundant source of goodness, an abundant source of life, of nourishment. Well, our mata needs to be nourished, and the only thing that can nurture it is the continuance of our speaking our language. If we view history solely through the eyes of those who came to our shores in the 16th century and beyond, we have a very limited perspective about the people of the land, Imanautautano. This is that periodization that we're most familiar with, right? We talk about Guam history, and we identify that there's a pre-contact era. So if contact occurred in 1521, then everything behind that is pre-contact. We talk about the Spanish colonial era. Usually we define this as the time when Legazpi claimed Guam for Queen Mariana, and that extended to the period 1898, when the Spanish-American War was fought and we were part of the spoils. We talk about the early American naval era, beginning with Captain Glass coming in and claiming Guam for the United States, through the Second World War. We talk about the Japanese occupation, only 4 years in chronological time, but very significant years in terms of the experience of the CHamoru people. Then we talk about the post-war American era. Civilian government, naval government, then civilian government. And then we talk about Guamanian contemporary era. Look at the way these periods line up. Who is the focus of each of these periods? In pre-contact, what is the focus? Tell me. Contact, right? Contact. The outsiders. Who is the focus in the Spanish colonial era? The Spanish. Who's the focus in the early American naval era? The Americans. Who's the focus in the Japanese occupation? The Japanese. Who's the focus in the post-war American era? The Americans. Who's the focus in the Guamanian contemporary era? Guamanians. Guamanians are residents of Guam. All the people of Guam, right? Do you see Chamorros in any of these periods? That's the point. The point is that Chamorros are hidden in plain sight because our experience as a people runs through all of these periods. But it doesn't seem like we're predominant players, right? That's what revisionism is about. It's to correct this paradigm, to flesh it out, flush it out, so that it can be more represented of the experience of the people who went through it all, right? The storyline of the Chamorro people then is hidden in plain sight. We begin by asking different questions, we begin to explore and uncover our story. That young lady, that 9th grader, I don't know who she is. I hope one day she'll come up to me and say, I was the one who asked you that question, because I'd love to be able to hug her and kiss her and say thank you. But it's those kinds of questions that get us going in the right direction. In the 1980s, a group of us who were teaching Guam history and other courses at the University of Guam began this journey of writing different interpretations and challenging different interpretations. And we put all of our thoughts in this collection of readings called Chamorro Self-Determination, Y Diretsota. Believe me, we got slammed every which way by the history department, by the professors who were attached with MARC. We got slammed. It takes a lot of courage to depart from the norm, okay? But we began that effort, and then Tony Palomo wrote his book, An Island in Agony, and he wrote it from the perspective of the Chamorro people. What resulted from my journey became my book, Daughters of the Island, which MARC published as its first monograph. So I think, by then they got used to our departing from the norm and began to recognize that we had a story to tell. We just had to muster the courage to tell it. Some of you know Tony as Melia. Melia wrote this book, Melia Ramirez. He wrote this book, La Sangre Llama, which is about bloodlines, which is about genealogy. And that's another rich source for us to trace our roots and know how our families went where and who they married, and even the no-no kinds of relationships that were had, and how we are so mezcla today, how we are so mixed genetically today, because we come from a very rich genetic pool. There were, for example, the whalers, the pirates, the explorers. They brought disease, they brought new ideas, and they brought their genes. And so we have a lot of richness in our genetic pool today. Dr. Uggan, Catherine Uggan, wrote led the writing of a series called Haleta, and that was another major effort to begin to create balance in our story. Don Farrell wrote the history of the Mariana Islands from partition onward. That was another effort to look at the Marianas and what happened to the Marianas and why we're splintered from the perspective of the island people, the Chamorros and the Carolinians. Families in the face of survival And several other volumes have been written, a compendium of stories told by survivors or their family members, a very poignant book, a companion book that was written in Saipan by the children of the survivors or grandchildren of the survivors. These kids interviewed their grandparents and told their stories. And the volume is called We Drank Our Tears. And I'm told that this has been translated into something like 7 languages because people find it a fascinating book of stories. So the reconstruction of social reality in academic writing and creative works to centralize the wisdom, knowledge, and experience of Indigenous peoples is the substance and primary focus of historiography. And that's not limited to books either. Video samples of revisionist historiography can be found in Itinautau Marianas. Yes, Arlene, that is a revisionist product because you have people voicing their perspectives, but there are all kinds of people. Some who have studied what happened, others who have explored the language for what the language can help us to understand about the peopling of our part of the Pacific. Then there's the animated version of one of our legends of the girls who saved Guam, Maisa, which was done by the Department of Education's Chamorro Language and Culture program. There's another film, Fanhasuguahan, which is also an attempt at revisionism. Polly Eric's I Am Chamorro, even though he doesn't agree that Chamorro should be spelled with a capital C, capital H. It's okay in this period of time, but he has offered us a tremendous perspective on the whalers and the Chamorros who left on whaling ships and the stories that they began to form in their own lives elsewhere. So other video samples are the Finohadza series that was developed by GCC, which is, if you haven't seen it, it's online on the GCC website, and it's a fantastic series of different traditional practices. They talk about navigation, they talk about weaving, they talk about imanzo amti, many different perspectives, Chamorro traditional arts and practices, which can be found in that series. The film that Liana did, Mothering Guahan, she did for her, as part of her work for her thesis. That was a very powerful way of getting women to tell their story about how they understood mothering. War for Guam, Baltazar Agun directed that film, and a very powerful film about talking about the war for Guam. Because the war, not of our making, was fought on our homeland. So again, it gives a different perspective. And the history of Guam through song is also a very powerful statement. And Leonard, I hope that you'll be writing a chant soon on the elements of revisionism and on our language and how important it is, and mata, because I think through chants we can communicate so much about what we hold meaningful. Indigenous historiography then facilitates, now this is a little heavy, so we'll go through it a little bit slowly, but it facilitates transformative authenticity. What does that mean? Transformative authenticity means that we take on the understanding that what we do can be authentic too. Now that is driven by critical consciousness. That is driven when we think deeply about who we are and the kinds of responsibilities we have. And I learned this concept from Paulo Freire's concept of concientización. When we look inward, when we think deeply, we begin to become part of a stream of consciousness that allows us to do things or think things that we ordinarily wouldn't, that we take so much for granted. And it allows us to dabble into those areas of thought that we don't take for granted. Indigenous historiography changes history. It does change history because it makes us co-creators of the narrative, and we claim the language as a primary source. I'm going to show you what this means in an example. Brendan Cruz, he's not here, he's in, I think he's in Ponape now, managing one of the branches of the Bank of Guam. But Brendan and I communicate regularly. I didn't know this young man until he approached me through an email and asked if I could be the voice on his video that he was preparing as part of FESPAC. And I said, why my voice? And he said, I need a voice of a Sina. And I said, but there are many Sinas on Guam. And he just said, And I thought, oh, okay. And then he said, I heard that you're coming home. And I said, yeah, I'll be there actually in a few days, 4 or 5 days. And he said, we need to get this done right away. So I was in a studio with Brendan, whom I didn't really know, the day after I arrived. I arrived, 6:30 that night on the Honolulu flight, and the following morning I was in the studio at KUAM to give voice to this interpretation. He did a lot of research on the origin story. Now, many people know that story as Puntan and Fu'una, right? Well, Brendan challenged conventional historiography that way and said, Puntan means point, but what is the point of Puntan? And Fu'una is not a word. We know that the story was first recorded by a military wife, I think it was Margaret Higgins, in the early 1900s. And she may have heard the story, the names in the story differently, he said. So he did research and found words that were closely related to Puntan and Fu'una. The word Puntan, P-O-N rather than P-U-N, is the word that describes when the coconut dies, when it gets brown and it goes back into the earth and sprouts, that thing that comes out of the brown coconut to develop into a full coconut tree is called Puntan. So that process of rejuvenation, right? Of reincarnation of the coconut into a full-grown, living, giving tree, that process is called Puntan. And he thought, isn't that a more accurate way of naming the main male character in the story? Then he says, Fu'una, what does that mean? We know what Fortna means. Fortna means first. It means go ahead of. And so it makes all the sense in the world that the first mother, the female in the creation story who created the world, the people in the world, be named Fortna. So that is what goes behind his challenging conventional historiography to tell the story, the creation story, the CHamoru creation story, by renaming the characters, Puntan and Fortna. So I share that with you.
Giitinituhon, itinituhon, gehalom hinasun itzahululu, taihinikog zantaitse. Giitinituhon, guaha hinemhom, ti mafatitina si tano zani langit. Guaha ginin sumaga maisa na tautaw. Na mafatnaan, puntan. Anay man malofan megagay na sakan, mumalango si puntan. Zaha agang itzilunya palawan as fona. Ni mafanyaguntay na nadzantay tata, tay gwihigid sa gwidza. Hatago si fona, hafa umafatinas no itatawtaw niya. Si fona, ni kakananya at suli itatawtaw niya as puntan, zaha fatinas ihilutono. Gina niya tadok niya siha, hafatina si Addaw zanipilan. Gina ni haof niya, ilangit. Gina ni tatalo niya, itano. Gina ni babali niya, iisa. Za gina ni tetenan itatawtaw niya, i-exut zan waksalug siha. Za hafatina si Sadog zanitasi, gina ni meme niya. Anay munhadzan si Fona, hafatina si gwinahan ni hilutano siha, mumahalan zan manhaso, na ufamatinas tawtaw. Init sinigwenya si Fona. Hanain may sagwigwatu gitasi. Zaginin adzo, na imanhudzong iman mokfo na natawtaw. Itawtaw hadza.
Now, people said to me, really, Loling? The first, within less than 24 hours, you're endorsing a version of the origin story that hasn't been validated? We have to learn to be courageous. I took a bold step. I lent my voice and my support to this young man. Why? Because we have to support the young people who are willing to step out of the box, the conventional box. And validation is an iffy word. Who says that our creation mother was Funa? Who says? Validate that. And then we can validate Funa. But Fona makes all the sense in the world, right? That's what I mean. There's a lot that we can harvest from our language in terms of validation. Fona is a real word. We use the word to this day, and it means the first. Hanutsun Fona. Right? So this is very, very important. Now, all of this has taught us many things about what we can do, what we can get away with, how to do certain kinds of things, how to go and utilize our mata in imagining how to say something differently. Chronologically, the conventional periodization marks major events in Guam history. There's no question about that. We are an integral part of that history. But I had the great opportunity to work with a team of people. Dominica, I think I saw you coming in here, with Dominica, who's now the director of the Guam Museum, and with others, to reimagine what we would call those periods when telling the story of the CHamoru people. And so I became the chair of the Culture and Technical Committee, which reviewed the content of the exhibits. And we were charged with renaming traditional periods. And we were actively engaged in that. We had a lot of trouble when we were trying to think of these terms and create new terms in English. So one day we just said, okay, forget it. We're not going to do this in English. We are going to go into our mata and imagine what our ancestors experienced and say the name of the period from their perspective. So I believe that the most comprehensive expression of Chamorro revisionism to date can be found in the permanent exhibit of the Guam Museum. And if you haven't been there, please go. It's a wonderful expression of our journey. But it's also the creative expression of a lot of artists, young artists, Chamorros and non-Chamorros, who lent their talent to giving that story life through exhibits, through artwork, through interpretive demonstrations. So let's, for the sake of those of you who haven't yet visited the museum, let's go through the periods, beginning with that period often associated with the beginning of Guam history, 1521, and the period before being called pre. Let's go through those periods and look at the panels and examine the way that we were able to take what other people have worked on. Because this idea of changing the names of periods is not new on Guam. The Historic Preservation program with the Department of Parks and Recreation has attempted to offer a different kind of periodization. People who have taught history of Guam at the university here have offered different periodizations. The Historic Preservation Trust has offered a different way of determining how to tell the story. But we're still stuck on this idea of chronology, you know? We still think of history in a linear fashion. And we tried to break out of that mold when we named the periods that were turning points in the Chamorro experience. So let me share that with you. The title of the exhibit itself is Ihinanauta, Nui Manautautano Itzamoru Siha, the journey of the Chamorro people. So from the get-go, who's central to this story? The Chamorro people, right? And then we looked at the periods from a Chamorro perspective using the Chamorro language as a guide. And then we translated it into English. So the first period that describes that pre-contact and contact, we called Inasoda Imanmofo na Natautauta Zanitautau Sanlagu Siha. Now, for those of you who don't speak Chamorro, it roughly translates, conceptually translates, it's not a verbatim translation, but it roughly translates to first encounters with people from the West. So it situates the main actors as the people who are encountering, correct? I know that this may not mean a lot to a lot of people, but to me this was absolutely exciting that we were able to finally define significance from the perspective of the people of the land who were experiencing, rather than viewing history from the perspective of people who came and did things on our island. We began to look at what our people were doing, how were they responding, what was their role in all of this. And it changed our way of thinking about what to include in the exhibit. So that's very important. So this is the panel you're going to see that's associated with this period. Another period, which is at another turning point, is Itinalaika Ginini Sanhizo. Some of the changes that were being introduced. And that was associated with the Lanao de China trade, sometimes called the Manila Galleon trade or the Manila Acapulco Galleon trade. More broadly, it's known as the Lanao de China trade because those weren't the only ships that were part of this trade that brought exposure of different ideas, different articles, different ways of doing things to Guam. And there was an exchange. Tinalaika means exchange. So the people here were exchanging food, knowledge, their own technologies with the people who were coming, and vice versa. This period is often labeled the cross and the sword. But for Chamorros, those are two very, very important symbols. Ikiluz zanisabli. And all of that comes together, of course, in the interaction between Matapang and San Vitores. Another period, which is often called the Spanish Wars or the Chamorro-Spanish Wars, we describe as iinatsaki ni CHamoru siha, umamumuzi pat ufanlola. This was a period of Chamorro dilemma. This is the period during which Hurao made his famous speech. Kepuha chose not to fight, as did other Magalahi. Who are the heroes? Who are the victims? We're the survivors of people who survived. We are the descendants of people who survived. So it's a very mixed period, a period of dilemma. Gipapat y banderan España. We were under the American flag, but we were still Chamorros. What did that mean in terms of the way that we began to reinvent ourselves, our culture, our practice? The period of pirates and whalers and explorers is a very exciting period in Guam history. You know, I learned from the Guam collections here at MARC, I learned that my great-grandfather to the 17th generation played a major role. You know, the Torreses were active, and I learned that my grandfather, Luis de Torres, was an ardent historian of Guam history. He spoke Carolinian as well as Chamorro, as well as Spanish, as well as English, as well as French. And so he was able to communicate with all these guys that were stopping over. And he also made great visits to the island. So, you know, it's a fascinating period, but it also defines a lot of the families here on Guam who are part of that whaling expedition. And so that's another period that we identified. Ihinidzung iman mistisa, or manmistiso na CHamoru. The hybrid that evolved when Catholicism and Spanish practice melded with Chamorro practice to create what we know today as the Costumbrin CHamoru, Costumbrin Cultura. That was also a significant period in Guam history. Ginanasiha gininigeran España and America. The spoils of war. We became, as an island, a spoil of a war we didn't even know was fought. What did that do to people? If we are tautautano, and we're not even participating in this conflict, and then we're told that we're no longer tautautano because somebody else owns the tano that we thought we were tautautano of, what did that do to the psyche of our people? Guahan, colonizan America. This C word was not an easy word to introduce into our vocabulary at such a formal and public level. To actually come out and say we were a colony was a big deal. Because this is one of those C words that you never really use publicly. And so I thought that this was a major thing. This, the Americanization process, we called Sinatsalanya para Utafan Americano. We actually called this Fa Americano hit. But then the Chamorro speakers said that was too casual for the name of a period, so they made it a little bit more fancy, a little harder to pronounce, but it meant act American. And many of us still have that memory of going to school at a time when we were told, if you want to be good, if you want to get good grades, if you want to do this, if you want to do that, you have to act American. And we learned that acting American during this period was not the same as becoming American or being American. And so you would hear, like Nana would say, "Amrifa Americano ako, sa sempre mauli ka todo." Just act American and everything will be okay when we were at school, okay? So that meant don't speak Chamorro because then you get fined and you have to, make ice cream and clean the schoolyard and do those kinds of things. So this is the period that describes that experience, also known as the post-war American period, okay? But you'll have to admit that using Fa Americano is a much more exciting way of looking at this period in history. So why is this all important? This is all important because if we disconnect from our language, we disconnect from our past. And we, people like me who are already 68 years old, have a responsibility to encourage young people. Those of you who are here, those of you who might listen to this, those of you who don't think that this is important, we want to challenge that conventional wisdom. Because without it, under our watch, we will do something that 4,000 years of history did not do. We will disconnect. And that's too much of a price to pay. So I encourage all of you young ones to take on the responsibility, the challenge, the adventure of becoming revisionists. It's not scary. People may think you're crazy, but in the end, we will be able to tell a story that's different than the story that we know now. Thank you all so very, very much.